Herbert Norman, the Canadian ambassador to Egypt, is on his way to see President Nasser. He is doing what he has always wanted to do. He is helping to shape the course of history. His meetings with the Egyptian president have been crucial in negotiating an end to the Suez crisis. Herbert Norman is content. It is a moment to savor, this hour of his greatest triumph, for it will not last. His past, as it has so many times before, is about to return to haunt him. At this very moment, the Americans charge him with being a communist. They say he is at the very center of a web of betrayal that is being directed from Moscow. For 7 long years, Norman has fought off these charges against him. But this time, it will be different. This time, Herbert Norman's past will kill him. Herbert Norman's past begins here, in Nagano, Japan. When Herbert Norman stood below the bell at Zenkoji Temple at the age of 3, Japan had only recently emerged from centuries of isolation and feudal rule. His father had come here as a Methodist missionary in 1902. He and his wife built their house just down the road from Zenkoji Temple. It was as close an approximation of an Ontario Victorian house as they could manage, this far from home. Herbert occasionally accompanied his father on his missionary work. Daniel worked with the rail workers and farmers of Nagano and the leaders of the fledgling reform movements, including the communists. He said that Jesus had taught communism. While his father taught Herbert to fear the commandments of his God, his mother, Kate, taught him to fear the conventions of her world even more. She was forever telling him to act in a way that befitted his station as the son of a missionary. But as determined as Kate was to maintain the appearance of Victorian Canada, everywhere Herbert looked, he was confronted by an entirely different way of life. He became as Japanese as the culture would allow. He spoke Japanese, and he played with his Japanese friends. But in the fall of 1927, at the age of 18, he was sent off to a sanatorium in Canada. He had developed tuberculosis. His first encounter with the land of his parents is a shock. This is a very different world from the quiet provincial town of Nagano. Norman spends a year in a Calgary sanatorium. Here, for the first time, he meets people who don't believe in any God. He sends a letter to his father.
There is a strong tendency in here to atheism, which, though not blatant, undermines with a subtlety comparable to that of small drops of water wearing away a granite slab. In many ways, I am too lax, and things that would have shocked me unutterably a year ago do not even rouse my sensibilities now.
His year in the sanatorium has changed him. As the son of a Methodist minister, he has been brought up with moral absolutes. Now they've been called into question. In 1929, at the age of 20, Norman enters Victoria College. In the sober world of Anglo-Toronto, Victoria College is something of an unsettling hothouse of socialism. That year, the stock market collapses. And by the end of 1933, over 1/4 of the workforce is unemployed. When Norman delivers baskets of food to some of the destitute, he is horrified to discover that these men are living in caves on the banks of a river. As he tells his friends, there must be something drastically wrong with a society which compels some of its members to live in holes in the ground and nearly starve to death. Norman now begins the political journey that will later be held against him. He abandons his father's God for Karl Marx. He's convinced that the answer to the Depression lies in the Soviet Union.
In 1922, the Soviet Planning Commission surveyed the country's needs and how to fill them. For the first time, history saw a people plan its own future and build to the plan.
The world's first state-planned economy has eliminated unemployment. There is a comprehensive system of social security.
Russia worked to achieve Lenin's ideal. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs.
In the West, protests by the desperate and the hungry are put down by the police. Norman is outraged. He writes to his father.
No more carping at Russia. We first starve the lower classes, and if they rudely and vocally object, we're so kind as to either shoot them, and thus save both the state and themselves the trouble of supporting them, or give them free board and lodging in the Kingston Penitentiary.
His father responds with damning descriptions of the tyranny in the Soviet Union. Norman does not deny the tyranny, but he pleads that the Russian Revolution is only 15 years old.
Such a tremendous social upheaval needs time for readjustment. It doesn't need to hang its head before the world, or speak the language of cringing apology before capitalism, with its stupid wars and soul-crushing system.
Norman is not yet a total convert to communism. It is the idea that attracts him. He doesn't participate in the active political movements on the campus. Instead, he throws himself into his books. His fellow students characterize him as quiet and solitary. In the fall of 1933, he leaves to study history at Trinity College, Cambridge. He will be that much closer to the dark shadow that is descending over Europe. Cambridge, too, is seething with radical politics. Norman's landlord is a communist. One of his history professors has a single portrait in his room, that of Lenin. As a colonial student, in the motherland of the empire, is even more of an outsider than he had chosen to be at Victoria College. Communism will be his bridge into this new world. He soon joins the communist cell at Trinity. Their main objective is a united front against fascism. Hitler has just come to power in Germany. Mussolini has long been in power in Italy. And in his own Japan, a growing right-wing movement believes that the destiny of a greater Japan lies in a total devotion to the nation and to the emperor. Everywhere, the fascists are ascendant.
It is possible that under the banner of fascism, we will return to medieval patronage. Each man strictly in his class, with big business ruling supreme, supported by Hitler, a military dictatorship. That is the choice as I see it. Better socialism by revolution than the dark ages of fascism.
Another member in the Trinity cell who has come to the same conclusion is Michael Straight. Like Norman, his passage into the party has seemed inevitable.
There was really nowhere else to turn. The Peace Pledge Union, pacifists. Wonderful idea, but at the worst possible moment when Hitler was rearming Germany. Catholic Church. The head of the Jesuit said to me later on, it was a toss-up for me when I was a student in Cambridge, whether I'd become a Jesuit or join the Communist Party. And so this was the desperate kind of atmosphere in which there was no tradition. We did believe that society was collapsing. Historically, capitalism had come to the end of its life, as seen in the Depression. War was about to happen. All this would lead necessarily to the breakdown of society, and out of that breakdown would emerge a new world order.
Norman meets a leader in the Trinity cell who will have a decisive influence on him, as he did on Michael Straight.
I was visited by a dynamic, driven, intense leader called John Cornford. John decided there was going to be a communist revolution throughout the world, and he was going to be the Lenin of Great Britain. And his entire waking hours were dedicated solely to that end.
Under Cornford's tutelage, Norman now takes the next critical step in his political conversion. He decides to work for the party.
Herbert stopped coming to the cell meetings. And James explained that Herbert was dropping out of the cell to work with the Indians in Cambridge, all of whom were under the watchful eye of the British Colonial Office, because they were very much concerned as to what happened to these Indians when they went back into high positions in India, as they did. So if Herbert was assigned the task of working with the Indian students, it would have suggested that he would have gone underground.
There are those at Cambridge who will betray their country for the party. Norman must consider whether he will be one of them. They include Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, and Anthony Blunt. They will all later become infamous as Soviet spies.
And somebody like myself, who was essentially a student communist, wouldn't have thought of doing anything about it when he went back home. John Cornford, on the contrary, said to his lover, Margot Heinemann, "The only other thing I've loved in my life is the Communist Party." And I could have choked on those words, and most of us could. So here was a group essentially of what Keynes called amateur communists. Above them, a group of people who we called jokingly as moles, who were amateur communists but were going for one reason or another to be discreet about it as they moved on in their careers.
Is Norman, too, a mole? Or is he just a student communist? Whoever he is not so much a communist as to turn down a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship to study Japanese history at Harvard. He takes up his courtship of Irene Clark, who he had met at Victoria College. Soon after, they are married. But just 3 months after he and Irene arrive at Harvard, Norman faces a difficult decision. Should he join his friends who are fighting in Spain? General Franco is trying to topple the democratically elected Republican government. He is supported by Mussolini and by Hitler. The Republican government is supported by young men and women who have come to Spain from all over the world to fight in the international brigades. Many of them are communists. All of them are opposed to fascism.
I've thought from time to time very seriously of going to Spain. I've never discussed it with Irene. But I've come to the conclusion that my complete helplessness in things military would make me of little or no use. But the emotional pull to go is very strong.
Hitler is using Spain as a testing ground for his ambitions. The German Air Force is dropping bombs on Spanish civilians. Only the Soviet Union is offering material help to the beleaguered Spanish government. For Norman, Spain is proof of the rightness of his cause. And then his conviction is sealed by some devastating news.
I've been trying to shake the gloom that has settled on me after receiving news of the death of the best friend I had in Cambridge, John Cornford, killed by fascists in Spain. I was influenced by him more than any of my friends there, and under his tutelage, I entered the party. I not only respected him and his gifts, but loved him.
Two weeks after Cornford's death, Michael Straight is approached by the Soviet agent, Anthony Blunt.
When I was in the depths of grief about this, because I regarded him as an extraordinary person, Blunt came to me and said, now, what are your plans for the future? And I said, well, I really don't know. I don't have any. But I didn't have to have a job, unlike most of them. And he said, well, your friends have plans for you.
Does the party also have plans for Norman? And does his rage at the death of John Cornford now lead him to say yes? Or does he pour his feelings only into his letters?
I can't accept the view that preaching Christ is the highest endeavor of human life. Whatever idealism Christians possessed has not only ceased to be their monopoly, which it never was, but the real standard-bearer for humanity, for liberty, and man's right to develop freely is communism.
Norman now becomes the secretary for an organization that supports the communists in China. He joins another communist-dominated organization, the League Against War and Fascism, and he attends a Marxist study group at Harvard. Another member of the group is a young Japanese economist, Shigeto Tsuru. The lives of the two men will be tragically tied together. Tsuru had been arrested in Japan for his anti-militarist activities. To get him out of harm's way, his father had packed him off to the States.
I don't know if Herbert knew what I was, what kind of opinions I held. But I did know Robert Bryce fairly well, and he knew about me as one of the rare specimens of Marxist economists at Harvard. He may have introduced to Herbert that here is a Japanese fellow who is Marxist. You may be interested in meeting him.
With Tsuru's help, Norman begins to write his first book. He is writing about the emergence of Japan as a modern state. He is writing about the country he knows and loves. He believes that a knowledge of history can set men free. He hopes his book will remind his Japanese readers of the injustices of their recent feudal past and the dangerous remnants of that past that are still a part of their culture and are now bringing them to war. The book is his way of responding to the political repression in Japan in the only way he can.
Neither of us was able to do anything politically on the street. We were more interested in influencing public opinion through writing, but we did realize it would take a long time before we can actually stop Japanese militarism.
After completing his work at Harvard, Norman applies for a job with External Affairs in Canada. His brother is a missionary in Japan. His sister is married to a missionary. Only Norman has strayed from his father's path. In July 1939, Norman arrives to take up his job as the Japanese language officer in External Affairs. Norman shares a similar past with many of the young recruits at External, with people like Lester Pearson, who is also the son of a Methodist minister. Many of them had been involved in radical politics in their student days.
Certainly capitalism looked absolutely appalling at the time, with the level of unemployment everywhere practically in the Western world. And so it was not surprising that young, concerned, intellectually active people might well be communist. Karl Marx looked as though he could be right.
The young recruits at External have the power and influence to change their world. They're determined to wrest Canada from the mother country and take a more active role in international affairs. They are as confident in Canada as they are in themselves. Norman tells his friends he likes being on the inside of the inside. He says he wants to make history, not write about it. There is no security system in place at External, so Norman is not questioned about his past. Even if he had been, it probably wouldn't have made any difference. Prime Minister Mackenzie King says he doesn't mind having a few communists around. But with the outbreak of war in September of 1939, the leaders of the Communist Party of Canada are rounded up and interned. Norman confesses to a friend in External that he is frightened that he might be seized at any time because of his past associations. So he begins to distance himself from his former communist friends. He doesn't want to jeopardize his new career, and more importantly, his newfound self. When his book, Japan's Emergence as a Modern State, is published, it immediately establishes him as one of the preeminent Western scholars of modern Japan. The 31-year-old civil servant from Ottawa is called on by Washington and by London. Norman puts his past behind him. On May 18, 1940, Norman arrives in Tokyo to take up his new job as third secretary at the Canadian legation. He is exhilarated to finally return to the land of his birth. He visits with his parents, who he has not seen for many years. But his enthusiasm soon turns sour. His parents are now being interrogated at regular intervals by the government thought police. He establishes connections with a few left-wing scholars, but many are in jail. Others are too frightened by the police to meet with him. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. Norman and the rest of the legation staff are placed under house arrest. Soon after, he receives news of his father's death. After 7 months, he is released in exchange for a group of Japanese who have been deported from the United States. One of them is his old friend from Harvard, Shigeto Tsuru. It turns out to be a fateful encounter. Tsuru tells him that he had to leave behind at Harvard a valuable collection of books on Japanese history. He wants Norman to have them. When he arrives at Tsuru's apartment to retrieve them, he is confronted by FBI agents. They have searched the apartment and found references to the Marxist study group that both Tsuru and Norman had been members of. They are understandably suspicious of the man who now stands before them.
I'm with the FBI.
Well, I'm here to pick up some documents.
Norman is afraid his brief career at External may be in jeopardy. So he tells them he's on official Canadian government business.
With the Canadian government? This would be a good time for me to
But under closer questioning, he finally admits that his visit is unofficial. The FBI agents let him go, but the damage is done. They now open a file on Herbert Norman. By the time they are finished with him 15 years later, there will be more than 800 pages in his file. And his good friend Shigeto Tsuru will have to testify against him. On his return to Ottawa, Norman tells Lester Pearson about his run-in with the FBI. Pearson tries to help his friend. He sends a letter to J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI. He tells Hoover a lie. He tells him Norman had been on official Canadian government business. Hoover never replies. And Norman puts the matter behind him. But it won't be the last time that Pearson will try to protect him.
The greatest, wildest celebration of all was in New York's Times Square, where 2 million people, by far the greatest in the city's history, filled the streets all day waiting for the official...
On August 15th, 1945, the Japanese surrender.
It was all over. And when President Truman's announcement came at 7 o'clock, the lid really blew off.
Just 10 days later, Norman once again set sail for Japan. The firebombing of Tokyo has devastated the city. In the last months of the war, over 100,000 people have died in Tokyo alone. There's little food, and thousands more are still dying. The occupation of Japan will last for 7 years. It is headed by the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur. The aim of the occupation government is to create a democratic state modeled largely on their own. Theirs is a mission, and the missionary's son will play an important role in it. The U.S. State Department has a high regard for Norman's exceptional knowledge of Japan. They persuade the Canadian government to second him to the American Counterintelligence Corps with the rank of major. One part of his job is to arrange for the release of long-imprisoned Japanese radicals who had opposed the war, including the communists. Norman is ordered to go to Fuchu prison to release the political prisoners there. He describes the scene to his wife, who is still in Ottawa.
The most exciting experience was to drive out to a prison 20 miles from Tokyo and be the first Allied officials to enter a prison with 16 leading political prisoners, including 2 communists who had been in prison for 18 and 19 years. I never enjoyed anything so much as being able to tell them that according to General MacArthur's orders, they were to be released within a week.
Norman's excitement is prompted not by ideology, but by compassion. But the head of MacArthur's intelligence section, General Willoughby, sees it differently. He believes the occupation government has gone overboard in the release of the communists. He's a staunch admirer of Generalissimo Franco, whose picture adorns his office wall. MacArthur calls Willoughby his lovable fascist.
Willoughby was in favor of a peace or a democratization of Japan that would eliminate communist rather than eliminate fascist from the Japanese government. Obviously, ideologically, he and Norman were very much at odds, but interestingly, so was Willoughby and General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was in favor of a so-called hard peace, so was Herbert Norman. Willoughby was in favor of a so-called soft peace, i.e. keep the fascist in power. Why? Simply put, Willoughby was a fascist himself.
Willoughby sends a report to the FBI. He points out Norman's enthusiastic release of the communists at Fuchu. He never mentions that this was done on orders from MacArthur. The FBI had closed their Norman file in 1942. But 2 weeks after they received the report from Willoughby, they open it again. While Willoughby investigates Norman, General MacArthur calls on him for advice in the implementation of the occupation government's reform policies. The two men meet often. Few people anywhere on the Allied side have greater assets than Norman for the role in which history has now cast him. His book becomes a Bible for many in the occupation government.
When the war ends, there is one great book on Japan's emergence as a modern state, and that is Norman's book on that subject. There isn't a great deal of other scholarship. His is the pioneer work, but at that time it's the really greatest statement and overview of the Japan that Americans were confronting. You had to entrust the people to take their own destiny in their hands, and they could be trusted to do this. And you could indeed, by doing your revolution from above as the conquerors, you could allow a revolution to take place from below. Those were very potent ideas, and they were right. They worked.
Fear of the conqueror has been transformed into great expectations. At Tokyo University, there are enthusiastic demonstrations for a new Japan.
The students were all dressed in tattered clothing, dirty army uniforms, but their faces were so lively. Something you would never have seen before the war. They looked so liberated. There was nothing more to constrain them. There was this great sense of liberation that almost made you wonder if it was possible to have so much freedom. I read Norman's Japan's Emergence as a Modern State as soon as it was published. I set up a study group with my friends, and so we all read it. And as we studied this book, we were told that the modernization, the democratization of Japan, was not something that we only learned from Europe, but that it was, in fact, in our own tradition. This is what the book taught us. This was its message, and it encouraged us.
After completing his work for the occupation government, Norman is appointed head of the Canadian legation. He's 37 years old. In just 7 years, he has gone from third secretary to being the representative of his government in a very important post. Norman continues to be attentive to his relationship with MacArthur. He has been something of a cheerleader, but all his praise has been directed towards one goal: the democratization of Japan. But the two men are about to move in very different directions. With the communists poised for victory in China, the U.S. now sees Japan as an essential line of defense against further expansion of communism in Asia. Washington orders a reverse course in occupation government policy. Communists who had only recently been released are jailed again, and thousands of left-wing labor leaders are fired from their jobs on orders from General MacArthur. Norman is dismayed, but as a diplomat, he has been trained to suppress any direct expression of his feelings. When he gives a speech to the students of Keio University, he decides to take this opportunity. His speech is a warning.
To curtail freedom because of the ever-present likelihood that evil views will be circulated is to set in motion an even more dangerous policy. I beg you to do all in your power to cherish the freedom that you have and make good use of it. Once liberty is dead, people must lose their self-respect. Despair, envy, deceit, and malice will grow apace like weeds in a deserted garden. No one can deny that there are dangers.
As Norman delivers his speech, he knows he's being watched. With the arrival of the Cold War in Japan, Willoughby has accelerated his investigation of him. Most damning in Willoughby's eyes is Norman's association with his Marxist friend from Harvard, Shigeru Tsuru. Tsuru is now working for the Japanese government. Willoughby is convinced Norman and Tsuru together are exercising direct influence on occupation policy to bring the communists to power in Japan. He now coordinates his investigation of Norman with those of the FBI. When Norman goes to Tokyo Airport with his friend Okubo Genji, he is confronted by FBI agents.
Herbert went over with Okubo, and Okubo writes, surrounded by, in distance, plainclothesmen, a number of them. And Okubo had to submit his briefcase for examination and so on. That was the beginning, I think, of the suspicion against him by the American FBI.
Norman must be even more careful now of his criticism of the reverse course in occupation policy. So he turns to his writing. He knows that the Japanese themselves will have to complete the process of democratization that has been abandoned by the occupation. He publishes a book about a forgotten Japanese reformist, Ando Shoeki.
Many of Ando's writings, which existed in manuscript form, had been destroyed or lost during the air raids. And so at the end of the war, there were only fragments of Ando's writings left. And what Norman was saying was, look, you, the Japanese audience, have in your own history the spirit of iconoclasm, social justice, fighting against authority. This was incredibly impressive to many people at the time who were feeling overwhelmed by Westerners saying do this and do that, because they had to find their indigenous roots. In the milieu of World War II and right after World War II, the famous American saying was, a Jap is a Jap is a Jap. They're all the same. He was totally out of that frame of mind, so he understood their diversity, their complexity, their tensions. And that's why he had greater true rapport with Japanese intellectuals and Japanese of many different walks of life, that they really appreciated him in a way that probably they did not appreciate any other Westerner writing about Japan.
But it is not what the Japanese think that matters. Norman now becomes the victim of a tragic conjunction of circumstances. (1949) is a pivotal year. The Soviets detonate their first atomic bomb. China, the largest nation on Earth, has fallen to America's mortal enemy, the communists. And the Cold War in Europe is heating up.
Berlin, powder keg of Europe, saw a mass demonstration of indoctrinated young Germans.
Americans see themselves increasingly as the target of a monolithic communist movement.
But far more sinister to Americans was home front communism. Union Square in New York was the backdrop for these scenes of red violence. From their ranks will come the saboteurs, spies, and subversives should World War III be forced upon America.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
Herbert Norman is a name waiting to be named. On April 20th, 1950, Norman's name comes up for the first time in the hearings of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee in Washington. J. Edgar Hoover has passed to the committee the FBI's file on Norman, and so has General Willoughby, directly to the chief legal counsel of the committee, Robert Morris. He now picks up in Washington where Willoughby left off. In Tokyo, Norman has no idea that his work for the occupation is now evidence against him. Morris brings in a witness to allege that Norman's release of the prisoners at Fuchu had revitalized the Japanese Communist Party. He never mentions that it was done on MacArthur's orders. He goes on to accuse Norman of opposition to the reverse course of the occupation. He never mentions it was criticized by the Canadian government itself. He describes Norman's contacts with left-wing Japanese as part of a sinister plot. He never mentions that Norman had been recruited by the occupation government for precisely these valuable connections. The next day, External Affairs in Ottawa gets word that Norman's name has come up at the hearings. They cable Norman to tell him they don't believe they should issue a statement to the press. The new Minister for External Affairs, Lester Pearson, is sure it will blow over.
Spirit of the Constitution.
Norman agrees.
Naturally, I am disturbed that my name should have been chosen. I entirely agree with you that no useful purpose could be served by any public statement.
In the first place, one can't prove a negative. One can't prove innocence. And Herbert would know that nothing that he would say could prove innocence. As an officer in the Department of External Affairs, where we all had very much the view that our role was to keep out of the limelight, not to be making public arguments and stances, his proper role was to shut up and to leave it to the minister or the political level to say what they thought was appropriate and not run the risk of simply making things worse. And finally, I think he probably, knowing Herbert as I did, would think it was completely undignified to do it. It was getting down into the pen with the pigs, and he wouldn't want to do it.
After 3 months of testimony, the hearings failed to produce any evidence of treason. But the pursuit of Herbert Norman continues. To the senators and intelligence agents who are pursuing him, he no longer exists, except in terms of the man he might have been. He has become a case, an ideological abstraction, the enemy. On June 25, 1950, the Communists invade South Korea, and the Americans are even more determined to pursue the enemy within. They're busy dredging up Norman's past. And the evidence that now dramatically tips the balance against Norman is his connection to his former roommate at Victoria College, Israel Halperin. Halperin was arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for espionage. His personal notebook was seized during the investigation, and Herbert Norman's name appeared 7 times in it. Halperin was acquitted, and the RCMP never followed up on Norman's name. but the FBI has. To make matters worse, when a British scientist is found guilty of atom bomb espionage, they find his name too is in Halperin's notebook. Unknown to Norman, his fate is now sealed. He is guilty by association with a man who had been a friend 20 years before, and another man who he has never met. The circle of spy chasers is now expanded to include the RCMP. J. Edgar Hoover doesn't think they've been doing a good job. He points out to them the suspected link between Norman, Halperin, and the British spy.
Basically, what they were telling the Canadians was, this guy fits all these this profile, and therefore he is a suspect, and in American eyes, very quickly was transformed into guilty, simply on the basis of his past. But again, I think that it wasn't, as I say, a normal sort of counterintelligence operation. It was a construction of a spy who might have been, or in some eyes should have been.
The RCMP now opens its own file on Norman. They're determined to prove their worth to the FBI. They inform External of their growing list of Norman's past associations. But Pearson says he will not surrender to the black madness of the witch hunt in Washington. He's concerned about Norman's present loyalties, not his former communist sympathies. And he prefers to base his judgment on his knowledge of the man. A man he has known since he first arrived in External 11 years before. Norman will be the test case for Pearson, whether he can keep the American witch hunt out of Ottawa.
External affairs was largely, almost entirely, staffed by people at the officer level who were very highly educated, had been to several universities for the most part, had postgraduate degrees, and were intellectually active and advanced. In the terms of that day, almost all of them would have been on the left wing. The RCMP were exactly the reverse. They took people largely with secondary education, secondary level education. Their interests and concerns were, by the nature of their job, right wing, for law and order and all those things. So there was a philosophical difference, there's no question about it, between the two agencies. And they would view these allegations about Herbert Norman being a communist when he was at Cambridge. RCMP probably thought that was quite serious. External Affairs would probably think it wasn't serious at all.
Pearson asks the RCMP not to send their report on Norman to the FBI until he has a chance to see it. He wants his friend to be judged in Ottawa. But he's too late. The RCMP has already sent it. External orders Norman to return to Ottawa. They feel they have no choice. There are just too many questions now. But External is sure giving Norman a hearing will put the matter to rest. Norman had been talking with Pearson about leaving Tokyo for another posting. He was considering London or Paris. Now he isn't sure whether there will ever be another posting. On the eve of Norman's departure, his friends hold a farewell party for him.
About 100 Japanese intellectual leaders of the time assembled. I think no other foreign scholar or visitor ever. He had such galaxy of important intellectual leaders assembled for a send-off meeting.
Norman's friends are celebrating a man they love. He understood their past history of repression. He joined with them in their hopes for a new Japan. They are the friends he is closest to, and he knows he may never see them again. On October 21st, 1950, the first interrogation of Herbert Norman begins. Norman knows he needs a clean bill of health, not just from his colleagues at External, but also from the RCMP, and he doesn't think this is possible. How can he justify to the RCMP who he had been and who he now is? He had believed in communism out of idealism and compassion for his fellow man at a time so desperate that there seemed to him nowhere else to turn. But compassion then is now defined as treachery. According to the new Canadian government security guidelines, former membership in the Communist Party is cause for dismissal. When he is asked the inevitable question, if he had been a member of the Communist Party, he admits only to having been associated with radical undergraduate groups. He says he doesn't know the political affiliations of his former friends. He had prided himself on never losing his composure, but after weeks of interrogation, he is seen crying in the East Block following one particular session. A colleague at External tells him that it's not going to go away. The Americans will keep going after him. He advises him to take an academic retreat. But for Norman, that would look like an admission of guilt. Besides, he's good at what he does. He still has a contribution to make. It's his life's work. After 6 weeks of hearings, the RCMP finds no evidence for espionage. They issue a new report and conclude Norman has not betrayed his country. But they still suspect External is protecting one of their own. As for the FBI, Norman's questioning behind closed doors seems too much like an old boys' club. They don't trust the RCMP, and they don't trust Norman's colleagues at External. Confirming their worst suspicions, Pearson now assigns Norman head of the American and Far Eastern Division. It will give him access to classified U.S. information. Pearson is thumbing his nose at Washington. The FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, Robert Morris, and the senators are all of them enraged. The Americans refuse to deal with Norman in his new position. He now finds he has a lot of time on his hands. So he works on a book on the meaning of history. That seems safe enough. But in May 1951, 2 British spies, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, defect to the Soviet Union. They had been at Cambridge while Norman was studying there. Morris and the senators speculate on a link between them and Norman. Pearson now feels he can't keep Norman in a position that involves Canada-U.S. relations, while suspicions about him are being repeatedly raised in Washington and now in London. He appoints him delegate to the United Nations. If Pearson thought this would get Norman out of harm's way, he could not have been more wrong. The head of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, Senator Pat McCarran, believes the UN is riddled with communists.
If the United Nations continues to be a cell from which communism radiates, if they continue to give support and encouragement to communist activities, then in my judgment, the United Nations should be removed from the United States of America.
The senators now step up their investigation of Norman, and they're helped in this by Norman's old nemesis, General Willoughby. Before leaving Japan, Willoughby secretly sends all his records on Norman to the chief legal counsel of the committee, Robert Morris. He has had 5 agents in Tokyo working full-time on the Norman case. Morris gets it all and makes good use of it.
He is claiming his privilege.
In a carefully staged move, Morris now produces a witness who is willing to testify in public that Norman was a communist.
Up until now, Senator, we have noticed this witness.
Dr. Karl Wittfogel tells the senators that during the late 30s, he had participated in a communist study group at Columbia University, and that Norman had been a member.
Wittfogel blew the whistle. He had been instructed to do so with the clear intention of embarrassing the Canadian government. The Americans were unhappy that after the interrogation the RCMP conducted of Herbert Norman in late 1950 had not produced the outcome that the FBI and the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee wanted, namely a clear statement that Norman was a communist. So they did this thing publicly.
The senators release Wittfogel's testimony to the press. For Norman's superiors at External, it is their worst nightmare. They now have to defend Norman in public. Pearson counters with a press release of his own. He points out that Norman has already been given a clean bill of health by the Canadian government. The senators ignore Pearson. Throughout the next months, Norman's name is repeatedly brought up. The senators are pulling out all the stops to put pressure on Norman and on the man they believe is covering up for him, Lester Pearson. They don't like the fact that Pearson has been lobbying to have the new communist government of China recognized by the United Nations. An American newspaper calls Pearson the most dangerous man in the Western world. The FBI now opens a file on Lester Pearson. But Pearson does have some friends in Washington. He is, after all, a minister in the government of Canada.
Well, you know, it's a funny thing when you brought up Lester Pearson's name in those days. Everybody immediately got a frown. You shouldn't have done that. He's our friend, or he is head of the General Assembly of the UN, or Secretary General of this or that. Everybody thought of Lester Pearson as a diplomatic god. I thought of him as trash myself, but that was a personal feeling about him. But gosh, you open your mouth about Lester Pearson in the wrong places and you'd get your head beaten in. I have great question about Lester Pearson. I don't think he was an active Soviet agent, but I wouldn't have liked him on my staff.
If the senators can't do much to get at Pearson directly, they can get at him in another way.
I think he saw it, that he was being targeted to get at Pearson, and he hated to be an embarrassment to the man he worked for and respected. I think if Herbert had been able to express his sense of frustration and anger a little bit more openly, it might have vented something for him and released it. But he wasn't built that way. He was very much the introvert, the scholar, the sensitive person who could not stand the thought that he was actually damaging the man he served, Pearson. Herbert asked to be withdrawn, realizing that he was an embarrassment to the Canadian government in these circumstances. I remember when it happened and Herbert's quiet departure, no farewell parties and all that.
Norman is assigned to do a foreign policy survey. This is just busy work. External hopes it will appease the Americans. They still think that the whole thing might yet blow over. But they're wrong. The RCMP now gets word from British intelligence that a high-ranking member of the British Communist Party has informed them that Norman had been a communist at Cambridge and that he had recruited students from India to the party. Under pressure from the RCMP, the FBI, and now British intelligence, Pearson can't refuse to let the RCMP question Norman once again. If Canada is to be a credible member of the Cold War Security Alliance, Norman may have to go. In January 1952, the second interrogation of Herbert Norman begins. It is conducted by RCMP Superintendent George McClellan, Inspector Guernsey, and George Glazebrook, the man in charge of security for external. This time, there are no friendly allies.
And I will ask Inspector Guernsey, who's much more closely related to the details.
Guernsey begins by asking Norman about the political affiliations of his friends. He asks about Shiketotsuru.
No, he was at Tufts College.
But neither then nor later does Norman ever incriminate any of his friends.
Would you class him as a communist?
No, I'm sure he wasn't.
Was he to the left of center?
In a general way, yes.
At Cambridge?
Yes, insofar as Hitler was concerned. I don't recall him being pro-Soviet, which was in effect somewhat my position in those years. Like most students, he was worried about fascism.
Yes, but would you say he was a communist?
No.
Again and again, the questions revolve around whether he had been a member of the Communist Party.
What about the League Against War and Fascism?
Well, I was certainly interested in Marxism, but I didn't engage in what you would say political activities.
Finally, Guernsey asks what is now most on their minds.
Would it be right to say that you were in charge of colonial work for the Indian students' secret communist group in Great Britain?
I had no such intention. I will say this, that I talked quite recklessly in those years, and I may have been a bit carefree, and I didn't weigh my words.
What would you say if a high executive of the British Communist Party stated that you, and none other than you, were in charge of colonial work at Cambridge?
Well, I don't know where he got that idea. I mean, he may have heard that I was a likely man for the job, but I never did such a job.
You have never
Norman insists he never joined the party.
No.
And this was technically true.
Very close to
He had never been a card-carrying member of the party. But based on the intelligence they have received from the British, his interrogators are already convinced he was a member. What concerns them now is, when did he break with the party? Or did he?
Well, if at some time you came to the conclusion that this was not for you, when would that be?
Well, I didn't have any sudden light on the road like St. Paul. Maybe it would have been better if I had. But looking back now, obviously now it seems to be causing you a lot of trouble. And certainly it's causing me a lot of trouble. I am not aware that I ever violated my duty to my government, nor have I ever engaged in what you might call conspiratorial activities, trying to pass off secret messages and this sort of thing.
So you were gradually moving away?
Yes, gradually moving away. Yes, I was maturing. Partly intellectual maturing.
Guernsey concludes that Norman is a risk to the security of the state.
You want to see me again?
The duty of external affairs is clear.
I don't think so.
Norman must be released from public service. But the RCMP can only advise. It's up to Pearson to make the decision. As they leave, Guernsey tells Norman he's lucky he has such loyal friends in external. But Norman is sure he has raised doubts among even his staunchest friends. He is sure his career at external is over. But Pearson goes out on a limb. After reading Norman's testimony, he concludes Norman had been a communist at Cambridge. But he still feels there is not the slightest evidence that Norman was ever a spy. He trusts Norman on the only point that matters to him: his loyalty to his country. Pearson orders the RCMP to close their Norman file. He moves Norman to where he can hurt neither himself nor his government. He appoints him High Commissioner to New Zealand. He hopes it is far enough away for everyone to forget. But the RCMP doesn't take any chances. The appointment is duly noted, along with the words, "Review Norman's activities in New Zealand." Norman, too, is cautious. He's even more careful now whom from his past he will see.
I think it was in Imperial Hotel. I noticed Herbert at the other end of the lobby. He noticed me also. We recognized each other, but he immediately looked sideways and indicated that he did not want to meet me on that occasion. He apparently was asked about me also, so he wanted to, he did not want to involve me in any other way, nor did I want to involve him. Both of us, I think, were in the same boat at the same time.
On his arrival in New Zealand, Norman writes to Pearson,
"Dear Mike, I want to tell you how much it has meant to me to have served under you, and how much it has sustained me over these difficult last 2 years. I'm very pleased to be serving Canada abroad again. I feel Irene and I will find life very interesting here."
Norman has been sent into exile, but he knows it is what he needs. He's worn out, and he's relieved to have survived it all. After 3 years in New Zealand, Pearson believes Norman can be safely resurrected. The worst of the Cold War hysteria in the U.S. seems to have blown over. He approves Norman's appointment as Canadian ambassador to Egypt. It seems like a safe appointment, but the timing is less than perfect.
A new Middle East crisis arises as President Nasser of Egypt tells a wildly cheering crowd in Alexandria that Egypt has seized the internationally owned Suez Canal. His announcement touches off a rapid series of reprisals and counter-reprisals. Britain freezes all Egyptian funds, and Egypt retaliates with the same measures. France lodges a bitter protest and suggests military action. The 85-year-old waterway of which the United States...
Norman has been sent to a posting that is now the center of world attention. The British are determined to regain control of the canal. They mobilize for war. Just 3 weeks later, Norman arrives in Egypt. There's no time to settle in. He works 7 days a week, often into the late hours of the night, dealing with the crisis. Soon after, he meets with President Nasser for the first time. Nasser's revolution is one of the first assertions of Third World independence. Egyptian nationalism is pitted against British imperialism. And Nasser suspects that Canada, as a Commonwealth country, is loyal to Britain. But Norman tells Nasser that Canada is sympathetic to the problems of nations emerging from colonial rule. It has a history of this itself. Nasser is impressed by Norman's knowledge of the politics of the Middle East. The two men get on well. External sends Norman's lucid dispatches to their embassies around the world. It seems to Norman that his past is finally behind him. On October 29, 1956, British and French paratroopers descend on Egypt. For the first time in its history, Canada refuses to endorse a British war action. Pearson says Canada will not be a colonial chore boy. Instead, he proposes a United Nations peacekeeping force, the first ever, and against great odds, negotiates for its acceptance by the major powers.
Requests, as a matter of priority, the Secretary General to submit to it within 48 hours a plan for the setting up, with the consent of the nations concerned, of an emergency international United Nations force to secure...
Norman's task is to convince Nasser that the Canadians can be trusted. Without Nasser's trust, Pearson's efforts at the UN cannot succeed. Norman's role is critical. But more than that, he can repay Pearson for all the years he has stood by him.
Canadian press and public in general were...
Over the next 6 months, he works relentlessly to keep Nasser's confidence and help Pearson negotiate the peace.
That this action had caused some considerable embarrassment to our government.
Pearson finally succeeds. UN troops replace the withdrawing British and French. Norman should be elated. His meetings with Nasser have been crucial in securing his acceptance of the UN force. But he's still not optimistic.
There is, I think, a lifting of tensions over the past week, but there is still a feeling of thunder in the air. I fear the present mood is full of hate and frustration, a dangerous mixture. I have been under the weather the last little while and still lack my usual energy. I've had a pretty austere regime of just office, and then trying to get all the rest I can. I feel very tired and rather depressed. Just a passing phase, I hope.
In Japan, Norman had been part of inventing a new country. Here, he only hopes that things will not get worse.
This whole episode will go down in history as one of the sorriest bits of tragic fiasco. I think Nasser enjoys a good crisis. I'm getting a bit weary of more than one a week.
On March 12th, Norman receives news of yet another crisis. Nasser has refused to allow Canadian soldiers as part of the UN force. He is still suspicious of the former colonials. In fact, in Canada, Pearson has been heavily criticized for abandoning the mother country. He needs Canadian troops in Egypt to take the heat off. Once again, a weary Norman sets off to see Nasser. That same day, unknown to Norman, his name comes up once again at a hearing of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee in Washington. The man who has been called to testify tells the senators that Norman is now the Canadian ambassador to Egypt. The senators can't believe what they have just heard. They can't believe the Canadian government is still harboring this dangerous man. Norman's presence in Egypt confirms their worst suspicions. The Middle East will be lost to the communists. Norman is at the very center of a web of betrayal. At the same time, Norman arrives at Nasser's summer palace. For 3 hours, he argues Canada's case, until finally Nasser relents and agrees to let Canadian soldiers participate in the UN force. Norman is elated. He has come through for Pearson. Two days later, he reads in the local press that he has once again been attacked by the Senate committee. He could hardly recognize himself in the person they were writing about. They had reduced his life to a case file, and he felt helpless to retrieve it. He knew now that they would never let him escape from who he had been. To the public, he would always be a suspect. Everything else he had done would be forgotten. That same day, Pearson denounces the charges against Norman. He says he will treat them with the contempt they deserve. External sends a formal protest to the U.S. State Department. Pearson wants the right of the Canadian government to investigate its own officials respected. It looks like the senators may finally be stopped. But Robert Morris goes on the offensive. He tells the State Department about the testimony of a former Soviet agent who has accused Pearson of being a spy. He asks them whether they would release it. They point out to him that Pearson is a hero, and that the release of that kind of testimony would get the U.S. government in a terrific jam with their Canadian friends. Morris complies He won't release the accusation against Pearson to the press. But the tacit understanding is that the Norman case can proceed. A week later, Norman receives a letter from a friend at External. It includes the news that Morris will continue his investigation of him, despite Pearson's protest. The letter is a turning point. Until then, he thought Pearson could protect him. Now he is sure Morris cannot be stopped. That same day, Morris returns to the first entry in Norman's file, the entry made by the FBI 15 years before. He calls Shigeto Tsuru to the stand.
I thought, when I received subpoena, if I come over to the Senate, explain to them how I came to contact with Herbert and Lawrence Marcus, and suggested to him to obtain my books on economic history of Japan through such and such connection. That would clear him. I thought that would be the end of the story on this matter.
But it wasn't. Tsuru had been confident he could handle the committee, but under questioning, he becomes rattled. He tells them what he will come to regret. He tells them about his association with Norman. The day the Cairo press reports on the Tsuru testimony, Norman goes to see the doctor who has been prescribing sedatives for him. He tells him that he worries that his friends are being dragged into the hearings. He worries that he has let Pearson down by not telling his interrogators the whole truth. He is plagued by the fact he has lied. He begins closing the door to his office, something he has never done before. He lies for hours on his couch and scarcely speaks to anyone. His career as a diplomat has depended on habits of discretion. He has worn a mask of composure in even the most trying of circumstances. Should he now fight the charges against him in the full light of publicity? On the evening of April 3rd, Norman goes to the Odeon Theater. The diplomatic community has been invited to a special screening. By chance, it is a Japanese film, The Mask of Destiny. He leaves his friends to sit alone at the front of the theater. Before him is the land of his childhood, the land of his greatest triumph, the home of his closest friends, and a protagonist in whom he can see something of himself. The movie is about a prince who wants to escape his destiny. He has a mask made that will make him appear as a commoner. The night the mask is delivered, the prince is murdered. The mask has foretold the destiny of the prince, who is fated to die as the victim of intrigue. After the screening, Norman tells his wife the movie has been assigned. At 8:30 the next morning, Herbert Norman takes the lift to the top floor of the Wadi El Nil building. He leaves a note for his friend, the Swedish ambassador, to apologize for using his building. He says it is the only clear jump where he can avoid hitting a passerby. He has 2 letters with him, one to his wife and another to his brother.
I am overwhelmed by my consciousness of sin. May God, in His infinite mercy, forgive me if He will. Time and the record will show to any who is impartial and not want to make every unsolved case stick to my name that I am innocent on the central issue. I have never conspired or committed an act against the security of our state. Never have I violated my oath of secrecy. But how the issues will be obscured and twisted. But I am too tired of it all. The forces against me are too formidable, even for an innocent man. And it is better to go now than to live indefinitely pelted with mud. The department will be greatly distressed at the possible implications of this, but I trust in an exhaustive and fair-minded study, which will uphold my innocence. Too many words. And I am too tired. Illusion has been my besetting weakness. Naivete, my chief flaw. I thought innocence of any act against security was enough. How naive. My loved ones will regret this act, but I believe they will understand the reasons for it. In utter humility, I beg their forgiveness.
Herbert Norman has taken control of his destiny in the only way he feels he can. Six months after Norman's death, Maruyama Masao writes an article about his friend. In it, he says, "If Herbert Norman, who so loved the good in men, and who had such faith in the power of reason to persuade men, has ended his short life in the midst of fanaticism and prejudices and intolerance, what should we do? We who remain behind.